So, Paul, I'm not going to give a big long bio for you because you're going to talk about all of your history, and you'll do it in a much more exciting way than I can. So let's kick off by you telling us how you ended up in this role.
Well, good morning, everybody, and it's lovely to see so many people joining us today, and it's nice to see some familiar faces and familiar names, so hi, everybody. My name is Paul Martin, my pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Chief Exec of LGBT Foundation. And I guess, like many of us on this call, growing up kind of like LGBT in this country, it was a difficult and challenging experience. There were no role models around. I remember, watching TV in my bedroom with the headphones on, with one headphone off, so hearing anyone kind of like, coming anywhere near my room, and watching sort of like, gay or well, not gay programs, but any programs that might have kind of like included gay in them. Channel 4 was always a good channel to watch. So growing up in the early 90s and coming out as a gay man was a challenging experience because we were in the height of the HIV hysteria. It was a really, really challenging experience, kind of like, coming out for many gay men back then. So I was at college and then on to university, got involved in the Gay Society, and sort of like, had my eyes opened really. And I think like for many of us, really, really kind of like, came out to many people at university my first year. So I think I got used to being in kind of like, quite an open environment. Went home for the summer holidays, and my parents discovered that I was gay, and they discovered I was gay because I hadn't been careful on de-gaying all of my luggage, and there was a gay badge, a gay pride badge in my dirty washing that my mum had kind of like worked through. Anyway, long story short, my parents found out that I was gay, and to my quite surprise, actually disowned me and threw me out the house. So I was a bit like left adrift. So I ran away to Manchester. Didn't know what else to kind of do.
Where did you live, Paul?
So I lived in Eastbourne, and I was at college in Preston. I was at Lancashire Poly, and had come home for the summer holidays. Had met a guy in Eastbourne, as you do, and we decided to kind of like, run away to Manchester because I couldn't go back to university because it was back in the days where your grant was based upon your parents' income, and my father refused to kind of like, sign my grant form, so I couldn't go back to uni. So I ran away to Manchester and spent my first night in Manchester in a homeless hostel in order to kind of like, go onto the housing list. And I started to volunteer at the Gay Centre. And because I'd had a year of working at university and the Gay Soc and with the student union, we've been doing quite a lot of work around sort of like, safer sex. And so I was kind of like quite surprised coming to Manchester on the gay scene. There was this no safer sex information out there at all. So I volunteered at the Gay Centre and with the council, and set up a gay men's HIV prevention project that eventually became sort of like Healthy Gay Manchester. That was my journey. So I started as a volunteer in Manchester, and then sort of got a part-time job with the council to deliver eroticizing safer sex workshops for gay men on the commercial gay scene. One of the most proudest marketing techniques I use to kind of like encourage gay men to come to these eroticizing safer sex workshops was offering free poppers. Obviously it was a health promotion thing. I couldn't offer actual poppers, so I gave everybody that came through the door a party popper. Some people found it funny, some people didn't, but it was a great lure to kind of like get people in. And I'm also kind of like thinking about like, the kind of like the arrogance of a 22-year-old gay man fresh out of university, sort of like, teaching men much older than me on ways to kind of like have safer sex and eroticize their sex life. But it takes courage to be a leader, I would say.
And this this organisation that you set up has eventually turned into the LGBT Foundation, hasn't it? Which is celebrating its big birthday this year. Tell us about that quickly.
Yeah, so Healthy Gay Manchester was the organisation that I founded back in kind of about 93, 94. That then merged with Switchboard in 2000 to become the Lesbian and Gay Foundation, and then became the LGBT Foundation in 2015. I'm sure we'll talk about some of that. And it's actually Switchboard that's celebrating its 50th anniversary. I wasn't around at the start in 1975, contrary to popular opinion. I've not been doing it for quite that long. I've only been sort of like, working and volunteering in the sector for 35 years. There were other pioneers that were ahead of me 50 years ago. So Switchboard was founded in 1975 on the 2nd of January. And it was founded by a small group of lesbians and gay men that had been quite active in the university, quite active on what consisted of the scene, had been organising fundraisers and other activities and stuff. And there was a recognition that there was a need for an information line. And so it was founded in 1975, and it operated out of someone's flat in Hume. And we always thought it was in a back bedroom, but we were told quite clearly, no. It was the Switchboard used to be run from halfway up the stairs. It was a maisonette in Hume, and it had one of those windows halfway up the stairs, and that's where the telephone was based, and that's where people ran the telephone from. And it's amazing.
Sorry, Paul, tell us about this from a leadership perspective, because this is interesting, isn't it? Like, there was nothing there at the time until this Switchboard arrived, and then it's run by somebody in their spare time voluntarily.
Yeah, so it's run at evenings and weekends. And I think that, I mean, it is amazing that back in 1975, people were prepared to sort of like put their personal telephone number in the local paper to advertise it as a lesbian and gay information line. There have been quite a bit of activity in terms of social groups in Manchester. In actual fact, Manchester was the home of the very, very first lesbian and gay community meeting. And I say lesbian and gay because that's what the politics of the time. So it was lesbians and gay. So it was totally inclusive. There were trans people involved, there were bisexual people involved, but the terminology was generally kind of like, gay or lesbian and gay. So Manchester's got a very proud history. So 1964 was the very, very first public meeting held in Church House, actually on Deansgate. So, working with the Church of England at the time. So, but people were, unbelievably brave, unbelievably courageous. We held an afternoon tea party on the 2nd of January, actually, and we had volunteers from every decade over the last 50 years present. And it was amazing to kind of like listen to their stories and, practical things like, how the women organize themselves, and sort of like one of them would sort of like, be the babysitter for their kids, so the others could kind of like, go and, get involved at, be campaigning, or sort of like answer a helpline, or run a parents group, and so on and so forth. So it was amazing, the activity that kind of took place. And it was amazing to kind of still hear the passion in people's voices about how proud they were of what they'd achieved. And it was an extraordinary time, I guess. I mean, in terms of not many people have done this. I mean, our helpline is, I think, the second or third oldest helpline in the country. I think there are one or two in London that sort of, had sort of like come into being in 1974. But it was an exceptionally courageous thing to do. But it was, I think, very endemic of the time in terms of that community-minded spirit and stuff, and how that helpline then developed and grew, and the Gay Centre, as was, kind of like grew out of that. George House Trust grew out of it, in the 80s and stuff. And so I think,
which is an HIV charity based in Manchester, for everybody,
which is also celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. But I think that there are many organisations, LGBT organisations in Manchester that can, you know, draw their history from Switchboard, or the volunteers involved in Switchboard. And we're doing a year of celebration this year, and so there will be an exhibition later on in the year, and we'll be doing online information and stuff. So we're currently curating, sort of like, you know, going through our archive and stuff, and just getting some really interesting facts and figures and pictures, some very interesting pictures of some dodgy haircuts and the flares that we're sort of like going to be displaying as we can like run up towards Manchester Pride and then beyond.
Talk to us about the 80s. Obviously, I think it's the most poignant time in LGBT history, at least that's most talked about. Maybe this time will be at some point as well. But talk to us about that time, just a bit. Have you got any good anecdotes as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I'll try. I mean, I wasn't around for the 80s personally, so I didn't come along until 89, 90. So my story really starts from the 90s. But I think that It's a Sin, that was the program that was developed and written by Russell T Davies, really gives you a good sense of what it was like to be a gay man, particularly during the 80s, and with the fear and threat of HIV. So I think that in terms of trying to weave our helpline story through that, what was increasingly happening during the early 80s was more and more people were ringing up the helpline in fear of either what they had done sexually and the risk they might have taken, and sort of like, you know, whether or not they would be have been exposed to the virus, or whether or not in actual fact they had just been diagnosed positive, and what they might kind of do and stuff. And I think that the number of calls grew so much that that's why Manchester AIDS Line was kind of like generated in 1985. But it was a very difficult decade, I think. I mean, I think it is true to say that lesbian and bi and trans people's identities were almost completely obliterated by the impact of HIV on gay and bi men, and sort of like the incredibly hostile media environment that existed. We also saw sort of like, you know, the rise of Margaret Thatcher and the Tories, and Section 28 came out in the late 80s, and there was you know, that famous conference speech that Margaret Thatcher gave about, you know, children being taught they had an inalienable right to be gay, and the sort of like the mood music that sort of like set was incredibly hostile and incredibly difficult. But what's also true to say is I think it probably was the time when our sector mobilized greatly. So lesbians, gay men, trans people all kind of came together to sort of like, you know, support people living with HIV. And as we kind of go towards the late 80s, we saw a rise of HIV prevention and safer sex information aimed at our community. And that's really where I kind of came in, and that was really the work that I did. But I also think we saw people towards the late 80s really mobilizing around Section 28, or Clause 28 as it was then. And Section 28, for those people that, you know, are not aware, is it was a piece of legislation that came from the Tory party that banned the promotion of homosexuality in schools. And even though Section 28 was never actually used in the 10 or so years that it was in existence, the threat and fear of Section 28 very much sort of like, you know, hung over everybody. And it had come from quite a gentle publication that had been available in schools, that I think was something called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. And Eric and Martin were a gay male couple that had adopted or fostered Jenny, and it just was like, you know, a picture book of their lives together and stuff. And it was just essentially a publication that was demonstrating that, you know, families came in lots of different shapes and sizes. It was a lovely little book, but it was just absolutely seized upon by particularly the religious right, and the Tories enacted populism, sort of like, you know, not only banned it but banned the promotion of homosexuality in schools.
Just to mention our report results that we released last week, Section 28 came out extremely strongly. Even now, people who went through it, who tend to be sort of my age and over, they they're still sort of struggling with some of the impacts of that now, and that comes through really strongly.
Yeah, no,
Really,
absolutely.
loads and loads of quotes about it.
I think it was a pernicious piece of legislation that made all of us feel very, very, very excluded. It didn't personally affect me because I'd left school by then and I was kind of like it, you know, I had been at college and university, and it was only really kind of like aimed at schools. But yeah, absolutely, anyone that grew up in that environment, it was a very, very, very hostile environment. It was a very, very, you know, and it was almost impossible for progressive teachers, liberal teachers, inclusive teachers to kind of talk to any of their students about being lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans, for the fear of being kind of like reported under Section 28. It was never used, but the fear of it kind of like was enough of a threat. And I think we are seeing similar legislation, particularly emerging in the States at the moment, particularly aimed at trans and non-binary people. You know, it's all wrapped up in sort of like, you know, who will protect the children, who will look out for the children. And actually, you know, queer kids are sort of like, you know, experiencing extreme forms of harassment and discrimination in schools without anyone sort of like, you know, making it worse. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me it comes out as an important part of that excellent research that you've done.
Thank you, thank you. The other element of it, of course, is that it's about this kind of age that people do move into or have the potential to move into some leadership roles. And so you've got the sort of the leaders of the present, if you like, having dealt with Section 28 in the past, which is quite an interesting angle, I think, to look at these things from. And Paul, as you mentioned to me when we had our pre-meet, the teachers of today went through Section 28 themselves. So that's also, you know, an angle that I hadn't thought of before. Talk to me about the leadership around that time then. The challenges were Section 28, this history of HIV. Before that, it was almost unheard of to be gay out in the world. What were the key leadership challenges, would you say, and who did what?
Well, I think lots of people did many things, really, Claire. I mean, I think that the you know the LGBT voluntary sector movement kind of like really went up a couple of gears during this time. We saw big organizations now like Terence Higgins Trust kind of like, you know, emerge. We saw quite a lot of other HIV care organizations appearing up and down the country. But what we also saw was sort of like, you know, emerging LGBT organizations, or, you know, and I think that from a leadership perspective, you know, most of us hadn't been trained to be sort of like, you know, community sector leaders. So we made it up as we went along, really. I mean, I think that the professionalization of the voluntary sector came a little bit later, but there was a lot of people that were willing to provide support. There were a lot of allies out there. And I think that certainly from my perspective, I was mentored and nurtured by a number of people in the council. Hugh Polhampton is you know, one of the most notable names for me to kind of mention. And Hugh was my first boss at the council, and he was an amazing manager and mentor, and I'm still very much he's in my life still today, I'm pleased to say. But I think that it was about relying on other people that had some experience and wanted to be supportive and wanted to do some things to help. We were very clear that we needed to generate an evidence base, much like you and Matt with Pride and Leadership, in terms of the evidence base that you're generating around leadership styles and what the needs are. So we ran in 1993 a regional men who have sex with men needs assessment, which was sort of like really groundbreaking at its time. And we involved a lot of community members. We trained up community members to kind of like be outreach volunteers and interviewers. And we went all over the Northwest, Blackpool, any other sort of like, you know, Lancashire town that had gay bars and stuff, and obviously Manchester as well. And we actually interviewed 972 men in the end, and we got Lancaster University to do the analysis, and it gave us a really strong basis from which to then kind of like argue with the then council and the then health authority about funding for particularly gay and bi men's HIV prevention work and stuff. So I think, one of the leadership challenges was actually about putting professional face on sort of like, what it was we were trying to achieve. It wasn't just a group of community members that were sort of like, talking about, the moral reasons. We were actually talking about the kind of like the practical and economic reasons. And from almost like the very, very beginning of my time, I've always tried to think about how do you put a professional face on the needs of LGBTQ plus people and community needs, because there are so many people that are willing to kind of like knock you down and sort of like challenge you and stuff. So that professionalization is really, really important. I also think building those alliances, building those allegiances is incredibly vital, because you can't fight it all yourself. But it's interesting in terms of casting my mind back to the start of my career. There was no internet, there was no email, there was no World Wide Web. We were one of the first organizations in Manchester to have a website back in the mid-90s, and people thought it was very wild and sort of like exotic. I still remember the very first computer that I had, because of course when I started at the council they still had a typing pool, and you were not allowed to type your own letters. You had to write it out on a flimsy in rough, and it had to go down to the typing pool. You'd get a draft back, you'd correct it, and it would go back, and then you'd get it on letterhead and you'd sign it. And you'd always have handy Tipex, because they always got it wrong. I remember a friend of mine that worked in the health service sent out a letter to everybody inviting them to a seminar, which should have been about men who have sex with men, but unfortunately his secretary had missed off a letter, and so everybody was invited to a seminar to men who have sex with me, and it was very easy to do, and there wasn't autocorrect. So and I remember that being on many people's walls for many years in terms of how funny that was. But it was a very, very different time. It was somebody's job, our team meeting, to put out the ashtrays. And it was somebody's job to kind of clear them up. I had a rule that you had to not throw the fag butts away at the end of the day, because I was always worried about the office burning down. So it was a different world back then, and so therefore the leadership challenges probably were similar as today, but they were different from an IT and digital kind of like perspective. When we merged with Switchboard, I'm jumping ahead to the noughties, but when we merged with Switchboard, our pile on social media was getting a couple of letters in the Pink News newspaper that used, Pink paper that used to come out every week, and there was only ever 6 community letters, and for 2 weeks running I had 2 letters of complaint about the merger that we were doing, and that was like the equivalent of a pile on then, and everybody was talking about, oh my God, what's happening in Manchester. So it was a very different world, but the leadership challenges were ones that we had to mobilize without the support of the internet and without social media.
Take us forward then, Paul, because that's good backdrop. Take us forward into the 2000s and some of the work that you did then.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that the big thing was about Switchboard and Healthy Gay Manchester as was then kind of coming together to create the Lesbian and Gay Foundation. So Switchboard by this point had been in existence for 25 years. It was very much a volunteer-run organisation with one part-time administrator. Healthy Gay Manchester was a gay men's HIV prevention organisation that had probably about 20 staff and probably about 50 volunteers, and was very much a kind of like quite a progressive organisation. It was a campaigning organisation. It was kind of quite in your face in terms of messaging. So the cultures of the 2 organisations were quite different in terms of kind of coming together. But what we wanted to do was that Healthy Gay Manchester was aimed exclusively at men, and somebody called Jackie Cross, who was the chair of Switchboard at the time, wanted to sort of like have something like that aimed at lesbian and bi women. So we became quite friendly. She had approached me to help her with a bid to the lottery, and off the back of that we'd got very, very friendly, and then we'd had a very drunken night one night, and on the back of one of the cigarette packs that we'd smoked. We kind of like mapped out what an LGBT organization kind of might look like, and that's where the Lesbian and Gay Foundation kind of was formed. It wasn't embraced by everybody. There was definitely some opposition from some parts of the community that didn't want to see the two organisations kind of come together, or Healthy Gay Manchester take over Switchboard. But we persevered and we moved forward and we brought people kind of with us. And I think that's an important leadership challenge or leadership lesson, which is, you know, bringing people with you. One of my biggest critics, who wrote 2 of the letters in the Pink News or Pink paper, I actually invited to join my board a year after we had merged and stuff, and he agreed. And I think that was really, really quite important, not to personalize the kind of like the opposition, not to personalize the disagreement, and actually kind of like try and find ways to build bridges, how to sort of like, you know, move forward together. And so we, you know, we really, really worked hard to kind of like, you know, bring people with us. But I think for the very, very first time, we had an organization that was looking very much about what men and women needed, and what all different parts of the community kind of wanted. We saw some really, really important health promotion activities aimed at lesbian and bi women who are practically invisible in the space, and we produced some amazing resources. We had a women's leadership group internally that produced some amazing stuff. We had a range of people working in the community. We were doing massive, great safer sex events. I can't tell you some of the leadership challenges of some of those because we're pre-watershed. Invite me back after 9 with wine, and I can tell you more about some of the real problems that we encountered in some of those nightclubs with some of those safer sex promotion events that we put on. But there was some real exciting opportunities, and I think particularly in the late 90s and early noughties, there were some really, really, really amazing partnerships that we had with the council in Manchester and with the health authority, and did some really, really kind of like exciting stuff. We developed an integrated distribution network with leaflet racks and poster sites all around the venues in Greater Manchester. We developed Out Northwest, which was a Northwest magazine that was kind of like ran for many, many years. We got the developed and delivered one of the Europe's longest running condom and lube distribution schemes, you know, we started to produce huge amounts of information that was targeted at our community, because our community had never had that information in the context of our lives. I remember distributing condoms to gay men, and some of the gay men going, well, why am I being warned about pregnancy in the information? Because, you know, that's the least of my worries. And so what we ended up doing was kind of like, you know, producing those safer sex packs with information on their correct use. And I remember taking legal advice about to what extent could I show an erection, because there was the Obscene Publications Act that was in place at that time. Would you believe actually you couldn't show an erection at more than 45 degree angle? So those protractors that we were kind of like taught to use at school came in really handy with our photo shoots and the photo spreads afterwards, kind of like just measuring the angle. And that's honestly what we were doing. I promise that's what we were doing. But I mean, I think that the reality is that we had developed some amazingly progressive services, some amazingly progressive activities for lots of different parts of the community. And increasingly we started to reach out to maybe the more overlooked members of our community. So the bears, the skins, you know, the rubber guys. We were looking at different kind of groups of women and networks of women and stuff. So we were reaching out to different groups and actually developing you know, services and activities that were designed by those communities for those communities, and often really delivered by those communities. So it was exciting times, and nobody else was really doing that. And it was an opportunity for us to deliver things that we needed and that we wanted in a way that worked for us. So it was a very personally empowering time as well to see the community respond in such a positive way. And then, of course, we also saw the rise of the gay village during that time, and you know, the big impact that queer as folk had on it, that Manto had on it, and sort of like how we were slowly but surely coming out of the shadows, coming out of the closed doors, and we were kind of like coming into the light as a community. And we were starting to really make some demands of government, and then we saw the whole kind of legislative change that came from the late 90s onwards.
And this felt like a boom time, I would say, for our community. We got gay marriage.
We got civil partnerships first.
Sorry,
civil partnerships
go ahead, tell.
Yeah. No, it's fine. But we had civil partnerships first, and I think that was how we became emboldened. So we became emboldened to kind of like ask for our rights. We started to stand up for our rights. We not only were doing needs assessments, but we were starting to develop strategies for LGBT healthcare in the Northwest. We had spent a lot of time, you know, working with politicians and decision makers. We were developing manifestos for regional and general elections. So we were starting to make ourselves kind of quite known. And I think that quite often the story is told through the London lens, because that's where a lot of the media is based. But I think some of the most progressive work happened in the region. Some of the most progressive work happened in sort of like the northern cities, Manchester, Sheffield, Birmingham, Leeds. I think that each of those cities have got really progressive stories to tell. And we've still not really joined all those up. We've still not necessarily told the story of, you know, our liberation from the lens of the regions, from the lens of the north, because it all sort of like, you know, tends to kind of like, you know, congregate and be focused on London. But there was some amazing stuff that was happening up here.
There's a challenge to the crowd. If there's any filmmakers, storytellers out there, this is a good one to pick up. Bring us into the present then, Paul, because we've gone through this amazing boom time where it feels like we're starting to be seen as equal, and we've gone into, for the last little while, something very different. Talk to us about how you saw that change.
Well, I suppose if I reflect it through my journey as a leader, so I started very much, I think there's 3 phases. One was as a founder. So, you know, with others, I founded the different organizations that started to kind of like, you know, do some work and deliver some services. And there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved in that journey over the last 50 years. People that have done some extraordinary things. Some people that have come and done one particular thing really, really well that was needed at that time. Other people that are still around today. And actually, there are a couple of people that have been doing this longer than I have that are still involved in our organization. So I think as a founder, you sort of like, you know, you sort of like lay the foundations, that you sort of like set the scene, you kind of identify the need, and you start to sort of like, you know, put things on and hope that people kind of come along. I think the middle phase is where I have just been talking about, is when you started to when I started to consolidate that, built the structures and the systems, and sort of like, you know, professionalized the work that we were doing. And I think that I'm in the phase at the moment, which is the 3rd phase, which is about growing the organization, growing the services, building them, making sure that they're really, really sustainable. And it's incredibly difficult in terms of the backdrop that we have at this precise moment in time, not least of which the financial challenges that sort of like, you know, exist for us as a country and us as a voluntary sector. There are some real challenges that we're having to face up to at the moment, but there are also some real opportunities, some possibilities that we can play to, and I'll mention that at the end of this talk. But I think that there are some amazing pieces of work that some of your, you know, some of the people on this call won't be aware of, that are too young to sort of like be aware of and stuff. But we did a piece of work in about 2010 around flying the rainbow flag, and we wanted to see the rainbow flag flown on public buildings, kind of like key gay event, you know, dates in the calendar. And we were told you can't, because there was a flag protocol policy that was kind of like overseen by a government department, because of course there was a flag flying protocol. that would only enable, and this dates it, you're only able to fly the Union Jack and the EU flag. You weren't allowed to kind of like fly any others apart from sort of like, you know, the country's flags in the countries of the 4 nations of the UK. And so we couldn't fly the rainbow flag. So we went about changing that policy and lobbying, and we got that policy changed. And so I think I've always been sort of like someone that's quite pragmatic, seen a challenge and tried to work out a solution to it. So, you know, the flag protocol policy was getting in the way, so let's get that changed. We managed to get that changed to great opposition from a number of different partners, but nonetheless we got it changed, even in a Tory well, it was a coalition government at the time, so that's probably why we managed to able to achieve it. And now we're also working on getting that flag protocol policy changed again, because we can't fly the progress flag on public buildings, because we're only allowed to fly the rainbow flag. So we're now changing it to kind of like, you know, get the progress flag flown. So hopefully later on this year, you'll see progress flags starting to be flown on public buildings, and that'll be because quietly behind the scenes we've kind of like, you know, changed the rules. We did a lot of work. I spent 7 years on sexual orientation monitoring, getting the public sector to monitor whether we're lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans. And you know, that achieved an enormous amount of opposition, enormous amount of challenge. But nonetheless, in 2017, I think it was, we managed to kind of like, you know, get sexual orientation monitored by the health service. And then in 2021, for the first time ever, the census monitored both sexual orientation and gender identity. So these sorts of, you know, achievements are often sort of like not the big sexy achievements. You know, not many people are going to take to the streets, you know, marching to monitor sexual orientation on, you know, health service kind of like documentations. But if you're not counted, you don't count. And so therefore, as you found in your survey, it's really, really important for people to put their hands up and tell you what their experiences have been, so that you can then share that with others to bring about long-term kind of change. And I think sexual orientation monitoring and gender identity monitoring is incredibly important, because for the first time ever, the census will give us information on the absolute baseline numbers of our community across the country and what some of particularly our economic needs might be. And the other exciting thing for those of us that filled the census in 100 years' time, when historians open the files, they'll read about us. We'll be part of the official record of this country in a way that we've never been really kind of like before. So I think it's really, really important for people to be kind of doing stuff. Do you know what I mean? Actually actively involved, actively engaged in bringing about change. And sometimes those change can be bureaucratic and technical and small, but nonetheless, those changes are really, really important in the grand scheme of things. We've also developed and delivered enormously impactful services alongside our helpline. You know, we've got domestic abuse services, we've got mental health support services, we've got drug and alcohol services. You know, we see over 45,000 people every single year as an organisation, and you know, we provide life-saving and life-affirming services and make a real difference to the lives of many parts of our community. So it's incredibly exciting to sort of like, you know, be part of that team that develops and delivers that. And it's very, very exciting to often be the spokesperson for some of those services in terms of, you know, the work that we're doing and the impact that we're having on our communities.
Yeah, I mean, I always say that the rainbow flag, I used to say, but of course the progress flag runs through the DNA of Greater Manchester in a way that it doesn't from other cities. I'm not from here, but I really perceive that as a big difference. And I think the LGBT Foundation and all of its history has contributed significantly, if not most, to that feeling. And it means that Greater Manchester is a different feeling place to other people and to other places. And everybody that's ever worked for you and with you should be commended for that, I think.
No,
we're lucky to have you.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I'm lucky to work with the people that I work with. because it is very much a team effort. And, you know, I couldn't be prouder of the team and their achievements and what they do. I mean, each and every day they are making a significant difference to the lives of LGBTQ plus people, our friends, our allies, and our families. And, you know, even 50 years on, the helpline still is dealing with coming out stories, dealing with people that are telling us for the very first time, very first people, for the privilege that we have of people telling us that they are LGBTQ plus. And, you know, a lot of people think, oh, you know, that there's still not a need for this. So there absolutely is, because we have a significant number of refugees and asylum seekers ring us. We have a significant number of trans people ringing us. We have a significant number of families and friends ringing us. And it's interesting that quite a lot of our staff and many of our volunteers started their journey with us through Ringing Helpline. I'm one of them. You know, when I was kind of like running away to Manchester, I rang Gay Switchboard to kind of like, you know, find out what the lay of the land was in Manchester and who I might be able to rely on for support. So I started my journey with Switchboard. There are many of my team that started their journey with the Switchboard or Helpline, and it's amazing that we're able to sort of like, you know, be able to tell those stories about the impact the services have had on us.
Well, we've got a few questions, but they're about the present situation. So one is about what do you think, how do you think the US focus on cutting DEI teams and programs affect queer leadership in the UK? And the other is about how do you stay positive and lead others in our community through what is an increasingly difficult political time. Somebody's asked if they can nick your idea on poppers, which I think, obviously, great idea. We should make them as part of our...
I've got other ideas for the after 9 kind of like post-watershed event that we did, but I mean, I'm not sure that, you know, I'm not sure, I get into trouble when I kind of like go off script, and I'm not sure that I should tell you some of those things, but there's definitely some other marketing ideas to kind of like entice queers to events that I could share.
Everybody email Paul directly for that. Paul, these are taking us right into the current situation. So obviously with that, we know you're not a lawyer, so just give us a bit of an overview of what's happened this morning and why it's important, and just what's been going on generally over the last few years that's taken us from quite a happy place, I would say, into a place of feeling a bit more cautious again.
Well, I think that whenever you look at a social justice movement, you always feel it's never linear. You know, you take a couple of steps forward, you take a couple of steps back, you go forward, you know, and actually that's what's happening. There have always been people that have opposed us. There are always people that have been the naysayers or have kind of like, you know, warned about all sorts of things that might happen for every step of the progress that we've had. Lesbians being able to kind of like, you know, have kids, you know, queer people being able to be on their partner's, you know, their child's birth certificate, being able to get a civil partnership and then a gay marriage, you know, and it's an incremental sort of like, you know, path that we're on. And I was trying to kind of like explain some of the hostility that we were experiencing in the 80s and 90s to try and put what we've got now into context, which is it's the same arguments. It's the same arguments that are being leveled at members of our community, particularly trans and non-binary people, that have always been there, you know, particularly about how to protect children. And when the rights of one group clash with the rights of another, you very rarely kind of like get a positive kind of like outcome when rights kind of collide. So what's happened this morning in essence is that the Scottish government a number of years ago, in an act of very progressive policy making, wanted to ensure that the number of women on boards, public boards and boards that they had some control over, had an equal number of women around the table. And then they further went to say that they wanted to ensure that trans women were included in that definition of a woman. And that seems perfectly logical, perfectly sensible to me, but there were people that objected to it. And it's been backwards and forwards to different courts in Scotland and now in England around sort of like whether or not the Scottish government were actually exceeding their legislative ability to kind of like define what a woman should be. And the recent appeal to the Supreme Court, the judgment came down this morning. I can't talk a lot about it because I think there's a lot of detail that still will kind of like come out, and it's a complex decision. But fundamentally, the Supreme Court has decided that sex is defined biologically, and so therefore that will have an impact on trans and non-binary people. To what extent, we're not entirely sure, but it feels like a setback. I know that there's lots of people, prior to this call, I was on other calls that people were very upset. My own organisation, our Trans and Non-Binary Staff Network, is currently meeting in an emergency session. We've been kind of like, providing support to members of our staff that are really, really affected by it. Because, people wear their hearts on their sleeves with this. This is a passion project. This is not a job, it's a career, it's a vocation. People are really serious about what they're doing. And I think that people just feel that, what we see is quite narrow pieces of law being argued in a very public space with an inordinate kind of like, press attention. The LGBT Foundation has had, I think, 6 front page Mail on Sunday stories. And I think our work's good. Don't get me wrong. I think our work is good. But when you think about what else is happening in the world, do we really warrant a first, a front page kind of story? Not kind of quite sure. So I think that there's a real anti sort of like, LGBTQ plus atmosphere that's particularly present in America at the moment. We're seeing a lot of rights being kind of rolled back. And I think one of your questions was about how do you sort of like remain positive? And I suppose, if I was to talk as a leader, my job now is to kind of like, support my team, because, we've had members of my team have been, kind of like, in tears this morning and absolutely fraught and devastated. So I've got to kind of like try and find a way to kind of like reach them, support them without patronizing them, support them without sort of like, brushing their kind of like, genuinely, kind of like emotional response to this, and lift them up to kind of like, come back to work tomorrow and find a way to kind of like carry on with the fight. And I think that's really important, to kind of like constantly take the temperature of your team, making sure that you're supporting them, making sure that you are giving them what they kind of need. But equally, it's about being supported by amazing people. I couldn't do what I do without, some of the people in my professional life. There's one of the people that's incredibly important to me on this call, and I can see her bonny face kind of like smiling as I'm saying this. I'm not going to mention the name because she'll be embarrassed, but being surrounded by really positive, amazing people that just kind of lift you up and give you the opportunity to kind of like, be the best that you can be, is really, really important. And I think that you have to really, really, really make sure that you think about the longer term view, that actually the threats of rights being taken away from us is a very real thing. So the anti-trans voices, are kind of like, 1 degree separation from anti-LGBT voices. They're going for trans people, but they're just as much going after me, in all honesty. And I think there's lots of people on this call can do. I mean, there's lots of things that people on this call are doing anyway. We saw from your own research that, over 40% of people are mentoring and supporting and getting involved in positive LGBTQ plus leadership activities, which is amazing. But people on this call can do more. From my perspective, come and go on our website, join our newsletter, join our community action network. We're developing a community action network where we're building up a team of people to kind of like respond to consultations and do those administrative things that are really important. We want to make sure as many LGBTQ plus voices are recorded as possible. But there are lots of professional people on this call, So why not you think about becoming a trustee of an LGBT organisation? LGBT Foundation will be recruiting for volunteers, for trustees in the summer, and we're particularly going to be looking for people with legal, HR, or financial kind of like backgrounds. Those are the kind of skills and experiences that lots of people that lots of LGBT organisations will be kind of like looking for. So kind of get involved, donate. My director of marketing and fundraising is on this call. If I don't mention donations, she'll have my guts for garters this afternoon. But you know, LGBT organisations are in a really tricky financial situation at the moment. So the more generous you can be, whether that be, you know, we've got a Rainbow Wave team running in the Manchester 10K next month, which is amazing. Over 50 people raising money for us, which, you know, is beautiful. I'll be a cheerleader. I'm not going to be a runner. I'm not
Quite
built
right.
for running, but I'm built for hugging and I'm built for cheerleading. So I'm going to do that, and I'm quite good at that. But I think there's
It would be quite a radical response, wouldn't it, from businesses here?
Yeah.
If they said, in response to some of the negative stuff that's going on in the press, the DEI stuff that Sarah has mentioned as well in the comments, the DEI stuff that's coming over from America, if one of the things was, we're going to donate more to LGBT charities, or we're going to do more stuff now than we've done before. It's not just about waving the flags anymore. There's got to be more from us to demonstrate actively that we're not putting up with this.
It's really important to be present. It's really important to be, you know, I think the thing about it is that you've got to do something. You know, don't expect or rely on other people to stand up for your rights. You know, you've got to be present, you've got to be counted, you've got to do something. You know, for those of you that work for larger private sector organizations, quite often the LGBT staff network really struggle to get people to regularly turn up. So make an effort. You know, make an effort to do it for other people. You may well be in a very privileged place where, you know, you've got a great group of friends, you've got a partner, you've got a home, you kind of, everything is sorted for you. And I'm glad for that. I'm very glad for that. But make sure that you kind of like, you know, extend a helping hand to the other people that are still waiting to kind of get to that place. You're not necessarily doing it for yourself, you're doing it for other people. And I think that's really, really important. And I think it helps you kind of like keep motivated. I mean, I'm absolutely devastated about the judgment this morning, but hopefully what I've done today on this call doesn't show, because, you know, you've got to pick yourself up, paint on a smile, and kind of like carry on with the job. And I think that it's really, really important. And I mean, I struggle talking about myself personally. So today's been a bit of a stretch, talking about a bit of my personal story. And actually, you know, I very rarely do that. I'm much more interested in talking about other people and the organisation, the services we provide.
Did you reconcile with your parents, Paul?
I did with my mum, not my dad. So yeah. But I reconciled with mum primarily because she divorced my father. But it's really, really interesting because like he threw me out of the house, nothing to do with me for 30 years. And then on his deathbed, he wanted sort of like forgiveness. You know, being a wishy-washy liberal, I kind of did it and gave it, and I was kind of quite glad to do, because it put a full stop on it. But no, I had 30 years of him not in my life at all. But I had loads of other amazing older men in my life that were role models, that were mentors, that were supporters, people like Hugh that I mentioned, but there are plenty others that kind of, you know, I wouldn't say were father substitutes, but were amazing people that kind of like supported me and helped me and assisted me to kind of like, you know, do what I've kind of done. But I just want to make a final point, I suppose, about keeping positive, because I think it's going to get worse, if I'm honest with you. I think we're going to have more challenges. I think we're going to have more rights rolled back. I think that we are already experiencing quite a lot of requests of libraries in this country not to stock LGBT books. And that is very much from the playbook of the religious right from America. We saw last year a very, very hostile campaign against drag queens in particular, and particularly drag queen storytelling. And if anyone's ever been to a drag queen storytelling event, I mean, they are glorious. They are wonderful. And the kids not only love them, but they're safer with a drag queen than probably any other sort of like, you know, person authority in their lives and stuff. So what I would say is that we are going to see more and more attempts of our community being pushed into a corner and our rights being kind of like removed, which is why it's really important for us to stand resolute. And I think, Claire, the idea that anybody could persuade their organisation to be more progressive and more inclusive, because we've seen that. We've seen that with some LGBT staff networks, an organisation that I can't mention by name, but, you know, will have been very much in people's minds over the last kind of like 6 months. Their LGBT UK staff network have reached out to us and said, right, we're not happy with this. Will you kind of help us? Will you work with us to kind of like find a way of challenging what's happening with our American parent? The American parent had removed queer and trans from the staff network's name, and sort of like, you know, the UK version of kind of the staff network saying that's not acceptable, and we want to kind of support our American siblings. And so, you know, I think that we will see more and more and more erosion of our rights, and we need to stand firm and say, no, this is not acceptable. I mean, no one is taking away my right to be married to my husband. No one is going to take away my marriage. You know what I mean? Absolutely no one. I never thought it would happen. I was ambivalent to it at first, but then kind of like, you know, I'm a big convert of kind of like queer marriage and stuff. And so, you know, I think we have to be really clear when we say enough is enough. You know, there's the line, and you can't cross over it. And I think it's really important for us to be trans people's allies, because I think trans people are in the eye of the storm at the moment, and particularly trans women. And sort of like, you know, it is horrendous, some of the stuff that you see online. It's horrendous, some of the stuff that you see that is being done in the name of family. And I think that we need to stand up for people. We need to stand in front of people. We need to kind of like support people. Don't take their voice away. Don't speak on their behalf, but be an ally. Be, you know, a defender. Be someone that actually supports people.
Paul, thank you so much. That was whistle stop tour of the past challenges and the current challenges, and loads of ideas in there of how we can be leaders without, you don't need job titles sometimes, you don't need organizations behind you. Sometimes you can make massive contributions without those things, and that's probably the call to action that I'm hearing. There are a couple of questions that we didn't get to, but they weren't quite in line with what we were talking about, so I'm going to write directly to Daniel and Chris afterwards and follow up on those. Please do have a look at Pride in Leadership's events. Come to our online ones. They're free to attend. You know, they're on all the time. Please come. Have a look at the in-person ones. Have a look at the annual conference as well. It'd be amazing to have you there. Have a look at the mentoring that's provided for free, that platform. All you've got to do is put the effort into being a mentor or being a mentee. You know, we want to make a difference in this area. Read our report, share it, get it out there as widely as you can, and yeah, please just help each other and support each other, and be this wonderful community that we know we can be. Thank you, Paul, massively for everything that you've done.
Thank you so much. Thank you for you guys.
To the foundation.
You and Matt have done a great job as well. Well done on that research. It's fantastic. And if you haven't read it, read it. It's a really great piece of work. So thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. A great Easter. Thank you.